Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future.
If you live in today's world, you may be inclined to think that capitalism is the only viable way for our economies to exist. After all, it's been like that for centuries. But unfortunately, it's not serving the vast majority of people and certainly not the environment. Most companies today have the main goal of growth, expanding their market share, increasing revenue and profits, boosting returns to shareholders. However, we live on a planet that has finite resources. Endless growth is just not possible. So what's the alternative? Enter the concept of degrowth, which I will discuss today with Sara Madi, degrowth researcher and scholar at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Hello, Sara. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I mentioned our focus in the society of growth. So what is the problem of that? Can you expand a little bit on that issue?
Right. So I think it's important to get into how growth is sort of like capitalism's PR campaign. So it takes what is mainly a process of extraction and accumulation, and then it tries to peddle it as something that's, natural or good. And this framing has been so effective that barely any people ever even think to question it. As we can see by the polycrisis around us, that it is now clear that we've been ruining our economies, running behind this paradigm. And this is exactly what has gotten us onto this highway to basically hell. And the growth-driven damages and incursions into our natural world have triggered the development and expansion of things like the pandemic. And also, I think here, right in the imperial core in the West, this obsession with continuously protecting the institution of growth and protecting growth makes it very difficult for anybody who's trying to respond, whether it's in politics or whether it's in civil society, in a way that would protect people's well-being. So, yeah, I think that is the problem. And I think growth, to be honest, it's an enclosure of resources. It turns humans into commodities. It turns resources into commodities, and it concentrates the wealth among elites. And the fact that this has been a measure of progress shows how deeply capitalist thinking and ideology is steeped into our lives. I think that is the problem.
Would you say that this obsession with growth is global?
Yes, absolutely. I don't discount this. Maybe the scale might be very different and the influence might be, from north to south. But yes, I do think that the world as it currently stands, in a broad sense, this is global.
You also mentioned the word well-being there, and actually it leads nicely into one of my questions, which is the fact that, just as a preamble, we always talk about GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure of how well a country is doing. So, the economy grew X% last year. Oh no, we are in a recession. That means the GDP has been down for a certain amount of quarters. But really, there are studies that show that actually a higher GDP doesn't necessarily mean that people are feeling better. The people have a good lives in these countries. So why is GDP not a reliable indicator of human well-being?
Yeah, right. That's a great question. So I think mainstream economics and mainstream economists and theorists, they still think that growth is essential, and this blind belief in the GDP that is, just enriching the rich and killing the planet. And I mean, I think it's important to sort of go back and look at this historically. So the GDP came up during the Great Depression. So the Great Depression, obviously, as we know, it devastated the economies of, America and Western Europe, and governments, specifically in the United States, found themselves, struggling for a response. And they sort of pinned this guy called Simon Kuznets, and he was an economist, and they asked him to come up with an accounting system that would reveal all the monetary value of all the goods and services that, are produced by economy. And the idea was that if you see what is happening in the economy more clearly, you can figure out where things are going wrong and you can intervene more effectively. So Kuznets created something called the gross national product, which kind of led to the basis of what we call the GDP today, the gross domestic product, which is the metric that is used everywhere around the world. So it's important to understand that this context came up in a war. But also, what's even more important is the guy who created the GDP was no proponent of it being copy-pasted everywhere. He was very careful to tell people and tell the USA and tell them that the GDP is flawed because it tallies up monetized economic activity, essentially whatever's going in, whatever's coming out. And it doesn't care whether the activity is useful or destructive. So now to come back to your question, essentially what happened was the Second World War happened and then this was forgotten. So they just went with that. And the version of the GDP that was first designed, despite his warnings, is the one that got adopted. Yeah, essentially GDP doesn't care whether that activity is useful or, destructive. So for example, $1,000 of healthcare versus $1,000 of supply of arms and missiles to commit genocide is one and the same thing for the GDP. If you cut down a forest for furniture or timber for IKEA, the GDP goes up. If you extend the workday and push back the retirement age, the GDP goes up. If a pandemic causes hospital visits to rise, GDP goes up. That's how we know that millionaires doubled and tripled their wealth during the pandemic. And also, it's important to note that the GDP does not include any cost accounting. It says nothing about the loss of life in a genocide. It says nothing about the loss of life in a pandemic. It says nothing about the toll that, working too much takes on people's minds and bodies in this current system that we have. And not only does it leave out what is bad, it also leaves out a lot of things that are very good. It does not count non-monetized activities, even when they're so essential, to our life and to our well-being. So, for example, if you grow your own food, if you grow your own herbs, if you clean your own house, or if you care for somebody, if you care for your family, your partner, or your child, or your aging parents, GDP says nothing. So it counts only if you pay a certain company to do these things for you. So originally, the guy who designed this, he did warn against all of this, but then, the war happened and all of those things. So yeah, if you look at it just as a concept, sure, we can argue, and a lot of economists do argue that there's nothing wrong with, measuring some things and not measuring others. But, the GDP itself does not really have any impact in the real world. The problem is GDP growth. That is what does have an impact on our world. And as soon as we start focusing on GDP growth, we are not only promoting the things that GDP measures, we're also promoting the indefinite, unstoppable increase of those things, regardless of the cost. So that is where things become problematic. And that's the soup we're in today.
Yeah. And what you mentioned earlier about the fact that people who care for their families are not not counted in all of this. So the value that they bring to society, and that sort of speaks of the challenge that is for women mostly. If you're a housewife, then you're not useful, quote unquote. Well, actually, you're doing a lot of work. It's unpaid. It's not recognized. And then you end your life with a really small pension. Yeah, exactly. So, what do you get at the end of your life? Like a small pension, maybe a state pension or something like that. So all that work went unpaid and unaccounted for.
In terms of the GDP, there's also something there's also an example that comes to mind from my own home country, India, where there are people who cook and clean and, who go from house to house cooking and cleaning. And most middle class people, most lower upper middle class people, as well as elite class people, their existence would completely fall apart without this. And all of these workers and cleaners, house cleaners and, essentially, it used to be impolite. People still refer to them as servants. Now there are more politer terms that people have started to use. But essentially, I feel like you should be brutally honest because they're treated as such by the economy, because that entire segment of people, which is millions and millions of workers and cleaners, they're categorized as the unorganized sector. So you can imagine.
Right. So is it like because it's informal work? Is that why?
Yeah, because apparently it's informal work because you just get paid in cash. Most people still get paid in cash. So there's no way to, and in many places, the practice has been formalized, but in many, many other cases, it hasn't been. And that's the majority. So
yeah.
So care work, any kind of labor is house labor, domestic labor is not, it's just unorganized. It's just one huge bracket. It's just extremely damaging.
So we were talking a bit about history earlier. So maybe you could tell us, when did this all start? When did we decide that capitalism was the way forward? Because, I'm sure when the world started, capitalism didn't exist.
I know that we all live in a place and in society where it feels like this is the default. Capitalism is not that old, it's couple hundred years old. It all started with the Industrial Revolution. Of course, forms of it existed before. There was enclosure, there was slavery, which is all, turning human lives into commodities. It's not that old as a system, technically.
So you are a proponent of degrowth. Can you explain what it is?
Right. So to put it very simply, degrowth is, and I'll reiterate this in different frames. So degrowth is a planned reduction of excessive energy and resource use in rich countries to bring the economy back into balance with the living world, while at the same time reducing inequality and improving people's access to resources that they need to, live long, healthy, and flourishing lives. So essentially, that's what degrowth is. Now, what does that mean? So what it's calling for is a reduction in resource and energy use in the global north. That's the demand, so that poorer nations can increase their output to meet their human needs. In the current setup of the world, most of the poor countries are working and slogging to meet the demands of the global north. This is what degrowth seeks to assuage. So essentially, in other words, in simpler words, it is a demand for radical convergence as well as, and global justice. So it stands for decolonization. It stands for de-enclosure of the commons, which is our natural resources that should belong to everybody and not just a few. It calls for decommodification of public goods, the de-intensification of everyday life, and, de-thingification of humans and nature. And essentially, as a result, the escalation of the climate crisis. So, for me, it is life. It's not just about ecology. It's also about economic justice. It's also about social justice. And I think it is, since we were talking about capitalism before, it is about the urgent need for transition away from this system. Yeah. And somebody asked me, why are you using, since this is a podcast which is focused on sustainability issues. So I want to bring this up, that we get asked that, why are you using the word degrowth instead of sustainability? Just say that, we need sustainability. And it's interesting to make this distinction, because sustainability is the goal. Degrowth is how we get there. So this sort of adds a little bit of clarity around, I hope this adds a little bit of clarity around what needs to be done. Hopefully makes it impossible to misunderstand and be confused.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think there are various proponents or various ways to get to sustainability. So I think it's important to make the distinction. And in fact, I had the question that, we speak a lot about the circular economy when it comes to business. So maybe, is that not enough? So
it's not enough. Then I want to elaborate that, essentially, the circular economy promotes the illusion that we can tackle all of our, ecological problems and everything that's happening with the climate crisis through smart engineering. It promises growth for business. And I think that is where the problem starts. That's exactly the problem. And I think it's very clear that the strategy for the circular economy was designed to make it attractive to large global corporations and, so that they become partners in their corporate responsibility and that kind of thing, where it's a nicer term to continue doing what you're already doing, which is keep creating output. So while technical solutions can result in a lower per unit impact, overall, the environmental benefits will largely be offset by the fact that we're still pursuing economic growth. So I think the issue is that the circular economy, while it offers, another option, another alternative to the linear take, make, dispose model, it faces a lot of challenges. I think it has limited scope. It focuses on resource efficiency without addressing deeper systemic issues. It's extremely tech focused. I think heavy reliance on technology really overlooks the fact that, socially and behaviorally, we are still wired for consumption. So basically, it's one of those things. It's kind of like deep green growth, where it's like, it doesn't matter if it's green as long as you're still growing, and growth at this rate is unsustainable. I think that, and what we really need to account for in everything that we do that we assume is sustainable, is that think of the biophysical reality of our world. In no way can we keep growing, even if it's ecological. Sustainable consumption is still, conscious consumption is still consumption. So I think on the circular economy, I think civil society organizations that are trying to identify and promote more systemic solutions to these, social and ecological challenges should sort of avoid falling into this trap of supporting and promoting this narrative as it's currently unfolding. And I see it all the time. There are civil society organizations and they want to change the system. And I would say that they should be wary of magic win-win formulas, that kind of address this global crisis. And instead, I think what we all should be doing, as individuals as well as organizations and collectives, is that we should be confronting these deeper issues that cannot be solved with a technical fix. So yeah, that is why it doesn't work. And I think essentially there's a whole lot of rethinking and criticality that needs to be put in every time we're trying to say that, circular economy is just like problem solved.
Yeah, absolutely. We always advocate for systemic change, shaking not burned, and just reviewing how everything works. And yeah, so we are speaking to businesses. The purpose of this podcast is speaking to businesses, and I can imagine a business be like, whoa, we need to grow. Excuse me. So
am I going to make some of your audiences angry?
No, I just wanted to ask you if you can provide some examples of how a company can still thrive in a degrowth system, or just apply degrowth concepts. Because after all, we do need some companies, right? We need someone to provide services in our society.
I think absolutely we do need companies. I think this is one of the misconceptions, that people just assume that degrowth is a recession and it just, it's austerity and it's going back to the dark ages. And I think because economic growth is seen as the only possible way to improve our living standards and improve the quality of our life every time. And, and of course, I can imagine anytime an economic crisis happens, critics of degrowth will say, very disingenuously, they go see, this is what happens when you degrow. And obviously, all of these assumptions are false. I mean, degrowth is the opposite of a recession, and recessions are unintentional, and degrowth is extremely planned and intentional. So, for example, we do not need SUVs. We do not need fast fashion. We do not need extractive industries. So I think any business has to rethink growth. They have to rethink that, why do you want to grow? If you're a restaurant, why do you need to? You can be a local restaurant who's sort of in your local council and in your local borough, local neighborhood, who's feeding people, and you could become an institution. There is nothing wrong with that. It's not business that we're going up against. We're going up against this unabated growth concept where it's like, why if you're a restaurant and you're doing well, why must you then open 10 more outlets, and then the quality goes down? What's the point? So I think essentially, I don't have a specific go-to tip here. I do think that degrowth does counter some industries which are just out and out extractive, such as fossil fuels, such as fast fashion, such as, automobiles, SUVs. It doesn't matter if they're electric. That the resource for the battery still has to be mined. So I think any company or organization, first of all, I'm keeping away from the word corporation here, but also them as well, because that's a whole other hegemonic force. But yeah, I think this is what we all need to really question, that, what is it about our current state of things and the way we move in this world that makes us want to keep expanding? Because, I mean, when it happens in our own body, we call it cancer, and that's exactly what's unfolding in the world right now.
And what you made me think as well is that degrowth is not decline. Otherwise, maybe the movement would have been called decline, right? So my understanding is, and tell me if I'm wrong, if you're a company and you have some level of market share, just examine whether you should be keeping your market share or aiming at increasing it for the sake of it, or because somebody asked you, I don't know, your investors. Because sometimes it is not sustainable, even for obviously, beyond the resources, or also as a business, it's hard. It's hard to aim at infinite market share. So why not just keep the right amount for you?
Right. Exactly. I agree.
And so I think that, when we speak about this obsession with growth, it makes me think of politicians that always talk about growth. We will bring more growth in this country and so on. And since learning about the concept of degrowth, I've been growing increasingly disappointed about this, because it seems, like such an obsession. And it's like, but what are we growing exactly? Like, what is the point? So, when we talk about society, so maybe even from a political perspective or just in general, can you provide other real life examples of degrowth?
Right, of course. So, I mean, I just want to say that, degrowth is not a monolith. It's not like this one thing, one size fits all thing. It's one idea. It is a network of, lots of concepts and ideas and practices that have also been borrowed from other societies. So it's not all just one thing that's sprouted up. And I think, it has to be perceived as a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. So some examples that, policy centric. So because my focus currently is on degrowth policies, so I want to take that frame in sort of providing these examples. So for example, one degrowth policy is energy and transportation downscaling. So Cuba is a terrific example of that. So they have reduced their oil dependency by promoting bicycles and public transport and carpooling. And the government also distributed over millions of bicycles when fuel shortages hit due to America's sanctions. And another policy-centric frame for Cuba, how amazing Cuba is, public services over growth. So despite all of the sanctions and hardships that have been brought to them by the USA, Cuba has maintained its free universal healthcare and education, and they have a very high life expectancy and literacy rates. And this is all despite low per capita GDP. So this is essentially what we are trying to prove, that, you do not need high GDP, because a lot of countries think that if you don't have GDP, you're going to fail. And that's not true. Costa Rica has extremely low GDP, but it's one of the best examples of economies and countries where well-being levels are high. It is constantly voted as one of the top countries in terms of well-being. Then if you want to look at universal basic services, another real-world example that is very consistent with degrowth is the expansion of public services and health and education and transport and energy that is provided cheaply or freely to everyone. So Spain is a good player in this. So they have a single payer healthcare system that delivers better health outcomes and longer life expectancies at roughly 1/4 of the cost and resource use of the US for-profit healthcare system. And I was just trying to remember the Costa Rica bit, and essentially they have as I was saying, they have extremely high well-being levels with very low ecological footprint. So they consistently rank highest in the world happiness scores and well-being metrics. They have a completely almost decarbonized energy system. So more than 99% of Costa Rica's electricity comes from renewables. So hydro, wind, geothermal. And Costa Rica managed to achieve this without any economic expansion in fossil fuel sectors, which a lot of bigger countries in Europe and the US, they say that, that's impossible. We have to expand in this sector in order to, be successful in the renewable sector. And that's just not true. And Costa Rica has excellent public services. They also have a forest conservation and ecosystem services policy. So they have this thing called PES over there, which is Payments for Environmental Services Program, that compensates landowners for preserving forests and reversing deforestation. So there are all kinds of, and then if we go further down into global majority, there's also the Buen River in Ecuador and Bolivia, where, these are more indigenous led models of prioritizing community well-being and harmony with nature, living in tune with nature rather than economic growth. So, as I said, all of these concepts weren't just created recently and pushed. These have existed, and we have to sort of, continue exploring. And I think in more recent policy, there are the, anti-waste laws in France, where, governments, they're really beginning to legislate for these longer lasting products and, less waste. So I think in a huge one in this category was the 2015 case where France passed a law that kind of outlawed planned obsolescence. So essentially, if you're a manufacturer, France made it illegal to deliberately reduce a product's lifespan just so that it would die sooner, like the iPhone concept.
Which is insane, by the way.
which is absolutely, it's abjectly insane. So yeah, essentially, there are lots, and I could keep talking about this because there are so many different policy buckets in degrowth, and there is so much to apply, and so much is already being applied in pockets around the world. And there is no dearth of inspiration to take from each other in terms of this. And it's not as novel a concept and practice as people imagine it to be.
Yeah, sometimes the solutions for sustainability are not new. Sometimes they've been around for centuries or millennia. But so it sounds like all of these are policy-led. So I know obviously you said that policy is your main focus, but is there a way that maybe businesses can take the lead in driving degrowth?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole there's a whole category on production, consumption, and businesses and trade. For example, a lot of companies, they can limit long distance trade. So, they can reduce the environmental impact and the social inequalities that result from these really extensive global trade networks. And they can, companies can produce more localized and sustainable economic models. So I feel like if they focus on this, what this could look like is, they could introduce export quotas to limit the volume of goods that are being, shipped to crazy long distances. And they could prioritize regional consumption cycles. And at the same time, transport demands should be reduced where possible. Another way to look at this is, another policy intervention could be shorter supply chains. So there need to be support policies and business practices that are put in place that shorten these supply chains, which will end up in enhancing the local production and the reduction in environmental impact that is associated with transporting these goods, because we are transporting a plain cotton t-shirt from Bangladesh all the way to Canada. Why can't we find more, of course, there's a whole reasoning for this. It's cheaper. They want to exploit labor. The costs remain down. That's the whole, basically, that's what the, format on which the fast fashion system runs. But, and we need to rethink our we need to renegotiate our trade agreements, for example. So we need to advocate for the revision of these existing agreements. We need to have stricter environmental standards, stricter labor laws, and we need to really, and this is really important to me, we need to have equitable terms for all nations involved, particularly prioritizing the needs of the global south, because most of the time when the corporation is based in the global north, the labor is basically treated as subhuman. Yeah. And I also think that another brilliant business-centric policy could be the easing of intellectual property rights. Why do people withhold intellectual property like that when they know that this is a product, or this is a service, or this is a provision that could make people's lives better? So people hold on to it. So I think we need to also push for reforms in international intellectual property law and regulations that sort of allow people for this, sharing of knowledge and technology and essential medicines. Many countries did not share their intellectual property during COVID, for the vaccine. And that ended up in late, if not ineffective, health interventions for so many people. There are still countries there are still people in this world who haven't gotten the vaccine, So as they say, the future is here. It's just not equally divided yet.
That's terrible, but it's true. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I currently don't have any questions, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
There's so much that I want to add, but I think
I know there is a lot to discuss.
Yeah, there's so much to discuss, but I guess I would just leave it at the fact that I think we need to be responsive to our world. And when I mean truly responsive, not just to, I know that it can be very difficult in our very busy lives and we feel like we're barely surviving, but there are people who have it much harder than we do, thanks to the lives that we are living in the global north. And this is specifically for people who are living in the global north. I think just by existing in the global north, you blow your carbon budgets, and as do the countries. So I think we need to really think about the kind of lives that we're living, not just on an individual level, but also like on an organizational level, on a structural level. And essentially pay attention to the fact that nothing is not connected. Everything is connected. So what is happening in Palestine is not disconnected from us. It is very much part of the, of what needs to degrow. It's the military industrial complex, and that is connected to ecology, that is connected to human rights. And that is also connected to what your country is giving to you. Somebody's healthcare is being taken away because that money is being used to, butcher people in another country far, far away from you. So I think if we start connecting the dots, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't become more radical in our approach to life and how we see things and how we see the concept of growth. And I think just start by asking those questions and doing that. Yeah.
The world has always functioned with people being oppressed and people oppressing them. But now, if you live in the global north, it's not obvious. So you need to figure it out basically by yourself that it is happening.
I think that is also a feature of capitalism. It makes us so busy and it bogs us down in the fact that we have to, we're too busy in our jobs trying to pay rent, and we're too busy trying to just figure things out. We're too busy trying to not fall ill because there's no healthcare in our country. So everything, this is a huge feature of capitalism. It's not just economic, it's also behavioral, it's also interpersonal. It alienates us from each other. It's not normal that there is a genocide going on and we just go on about our lives like nothing's happening. And I think this is where this is where we have gotten, where we really need to ask that what has happened? What happened? We were supposed to be, humans, man is a social animal. What happened to the social aspect? What happened to caring about each other?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and capitalism has completely separated us from each other.
Yeah, it feels like our very basic needs of, food and shelter are taken care of, at least, obviously here in the global north. But then a lot of our human side is, as you said, is alienated.
It's
It's
just
not
frozen.
part of our everyday lives. Yeah, exactly. Wow. Well, this took a bit of a different direction than usual, but I'm really glad it did, because it's so important to talk about these things. And
I'm glad.
And I hope, we can all reflect on this, and there are a lot of ways to apply degrowth, as we learned in this episode, apply growth principles in our everyday lives, and why not our businesses. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this great episode. It's been really illuminating, and I really appreciated having you here. And to our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. Why not follow us on our social media? We also have a newsletter as well. And see you next week.